In the year 1971, something revolutionary would strike family suburbs and vacation towns forever. Up until that point, the most frequented spots for youngsters to hang out were fast food joints and the library, and even then, it was difficult for everybody from every clique to get along there. But upon the introduction of computer space, the world's first arcade game, video game culture would be changed forever and provide an additional layer of entertainment for all ages. Computer space was the brainchild of Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, who became friends after meeting each other through their workplace, Ampex Data Systems, an electronics company that specialized in manufacturing data storage devices. Through their working relationship, Bushnell and Dabney would discover that they had many common interests, including digital entertainment and computer science. At some point, Bushnell expressed his desire to one day create a massive pizza parlor chain filled with electronic games and attractions to keep people coming back. To further convince Dabney, the two took a trip to the Stanford University Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which had recently got its hands on a copy of Space War, a space combat video game recently developed by Stephen Russell at MIT. Space War ran on a public domain code, meaning that the game's very building blocks were untouchable by intellectual property rights and were free for distribution to anybody with the means and dedication to understand it. After sampling what the game was capable of and turning their friendship into a business opportunity, Bushnell and Dabney decided to break away from Ampex to create their own startup, Syzygy. Together they worked on a Space War clone until they had a working prototype, and after some meetings and cold calls to manufacturing companies, signed an agreement with Nutting Associates, big at the time for creating coin-operated and shooting gallery games. Their final product was a fiberglass cabinet with a hard copy of Computer Space in it, accessible with a coin slot. The cabinet was mass-produced and shipped to pubs, restaurants, and bars everywhere. Though the monetary gain of their little venture was successful, amassing an estimated $3 million in sales, Computer Space failed to get the recognition that they were aiming for, and production quietly ceased not even a year after producing the first cabinet. When Bushnell and Dabney looked to begin their next venture, they were forced to change the name of their company after discovering that Syzygy was already in use by a candle company and a roofing company. It was here in 1972 that the famous Atari Inc. was born, making a reference to a position similar to check in the Chinese board game Go. For their next project, Bushnell and Dabney brought on an additional programmer who helped make the Magnavox Odyssey home console and created a table tennis game that would go on to be the highly successful Pong. From here, video game arcade cabinets began to spiral. Not only was video gaming hitting the home market thanks to Sanders Associates and the Odyssey, but other development companies had also started to spring up for a share in the budding video game industry. Sanders Associates continued to produce sequels and better versions of their games, and Japanese companies like Taito and Sega began making cabinets and shipping them worldwide. By the late 1970s, the world had unwittingly entered the golden age of arcade games, with iconic titles like Space Invaders, Centipede, Frogger, Donkey Kong, and Asteroids making their way onto the scene and spreading their influence like never before. Even the first ever major debate about video game violence swept through the United States in this time, thanks to the creation of a game called Death Race by Exidy in 1976. The trend was in full swing. Suddenly, kids had better places to be than football and band practice. The older, simpler games of lasers and dots were long past, and out of the bars and lounges of adult-only sections. Neighborhoods suddenly had rooms available to all ages alongside the basketball knockoffs and table hockey. Video game developers became household names, with companies like WMS, Konami, and Nintendo stealing the conversation at dinner and sleepovers everywhere. Of all the games to make their rounds though, none would surpass the fame and fortune of one specific arcade mascot, whose popularity spiraled so far that a pop culture phenomenon would shape the 1980s merely for existing. I'm of course talking about the Japanese-based Namco Limited's exemplary title, Pac-Man. Originally called Puck-Man in Japan, Pac-Man was developed and published in Asia by Namco, eventually getting released to North American arcades through Midway Manufacturing. Pac-Man was created by a team of 10 people, directed by a man named Toru Iwatani. Iwatani cited his desire to create a game that could be enjoyed by all ages and genders, since the majority of video games at arcades and in homes had some kind of theme that generated an unintentional demographic. In the late 70s, most games centered around conflict of some kind or a sport. In an effort to get more people to play their game, Iwatani had their game's characters made to be cute, colorful, but most of all recognizable, having famously used a pizza pie with a slice taken out of it as their inspiration for Pac-Man himself. Though for Japanese audiences, the character of Pac-Man is a subtle reference to the Japanese kanji for mouth, or kuchi, which looks like this. The end product was a simple game where the character is dropped into a maze made of blue lines with enemy ghosts that periodically leave their little safe house. The maze itself never changes, though the programming of the ghosts is designed to act differently depending on Pac-Man's placement and the actions the player takes while navigating the maze. Making contact with a ghost will vaporize Pac-Man, and the player loses a life. When all the lives are lost, the game ends and the high score is recorded. Spread throughout the maze, however, are energizer pellets that make the ghosts vulnerable for Pac-Man to attack. Upon release, Pac-Man earned a moderate success on the arcade game market, with another title that came out the year prior, Galaxian, outdoing it in sales and popularity for the first few months. However, as soon as Pac-Man caught on, it became very successful, becoming the highest grossing arcade game of 1980 according to Japanese Game Machine records. Space Invaders was the most popular game until this point, indicating the shift from space shooters and FPS games to action games and platformers with iconic characters had just begun. Over in the US, Midway had taken the safe bet with their initial manufacturing plan, creating a mere 5,000 units to be produced and distributed. It took even less time for Americans to catch the Pac-Man Fever, where it became a nationwide success in a few weeks and far surpassing Midway's estimates. Within just a year of release, 100,000 cabinets had been sold, overtaking Atari's Asteroids as the best-selling arcade game in the country and earning more than Star Wars: A New Hope with over an estimated $1 billion in revenue. Toru Iwatani's innovation had more than paid for itself, as by 1982, Vice President of Marketing Stanley Jaraki would go on to attribute Pac-Man's success to its massive number of female players, which at the time was a demographic largely untapped. In a book published at the end of that year, How to Win Video Games, by Pocketbooks of Gulf and Western Corporation, Pac-Man was cited to be the only game among the 9 talked about in the book to have a mostly female audience. Pac-Man would go on to become the best-selling arcade game of all time, with an estimated 3.5 billion to 6 billion in arcade cabinet sales and 10 billion in coin counting. After signing a deal with Atari, a home console version was made for the 2600, selling over 8 million copies and making making it the best-selling title for that console. Numerous other ports would be made for consoles all the way into the 2000s, with a version being made for the Nelsonic Game Watch, the Famicom, the Atari 5200 and XE, and the Game Boy Advance. It's estimated that as of 2016, Pac-Man and its dozens of re-releases have amassed more than $12 billion in revenue. The game would mark a massive turning point in video game culture upon release, as many games up to that point had been shoot-'em-up and racing games. Following Pac-Man's rampant success, Nintendo would go on to develop the precursor to their iconic Super Mario franchise, Donkey Kong. Konami began putting a mascot character at the front of their projects, with Frogger and Turtles headlining in 1981. Hanna-Barbera even picked up the rights to produce a cartoon for the Pellet Muncher that ran on ABC from September of 1982 to November of 1983, and is notable for being the first known cartoon based on a video game. With all of this immediate and immeasurable success, Pac-Man was bound to expand as a franchise. Many sequels, spin-offs, and remakes would be created to further the legacy of Pac-Man. This included Miss Pac-Man, the first follow-up made in 1982. It wasn't until 1994 that a traditional numbered sequel would be released on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and what came out of it is something incredibly special and novel to this day. Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures is a side-scrolling point-and-click adventure game, developed and published by Namco. This game is a massive departure from anything you may have already known about the guy, as in every iteration up to this point, and even after, Pac-Man is generally seen making his way through platforming stages and consuming pellets while dodging the ghosts and other environmental hazards. But this game isn't that. Not even remotely, actually. Power pellets are the only kind of consumable and are used in very distinct, very specific situations. Instead of navigating a maze, players are invited to sit back and watch Pac-Man explore his neighborhood, accomplishing various tasks at the behest of Miss Pac-Man or the people in his neighborhood. The player has no direct control over Pac-Man whatsoever. Instead, they're given a slingshot that is used to whack things on the screen and hopefully get Pac-Man to notice them somehow. This can lead to an experience that's either laughably comic or frustratingly grating, as you have limited control over who or what Pac-Man interacts with and instead suggests what he should do next. It's completely possible for the player to discover what needs to happen next, but getting Pac-Man to accomplish the goal is either impossible or just completely missed. The game is divided into 4.5 parts. In the beginning, Pac-Man invites the player to explore his property, using the slingshot to interact with things around his home to get acquainted with the mechanics. Shortly after, Pac-Man is given his first quest, in which he must venture into the neighborhood for a bottle of milk for Pac-Baby. Oh yeah, Pac-Man has a family now. This game uses a lot of lore from the animated show that aired in the 80s. So Pac-Man is officially married to Miss Pac-Man and has 2 kids, Pac Jr. and Pac-Baby. The quests are generally centered around his family and them being the targets of misdeeds by the ghosts Inky, Pinky, Blinky, and Clyde. After Pac-Man retrieves the bottle for Pac-Baby, Miss Pac-Man then reminds Pac-Man that their son Junior's best friend Lucy has a birthday coming up and sends him to the mountain ranges to find her favorite flowers as a present. After some crazy misadventures involving a minecart and a hang glider, Pac-Man will find the patch of flowers on the top of the mountain and bring some back to Lucy. Sometime after that, Junior himself has become a victim of the ghosts, with them having taken his guitar and fled fled to the city on the other side of the mountains. Pac-Man then ventures forth into the bustling metropolis to find them, and after some meddling in local businesses and generally making a fool out of himself, Pac-Man defeats the ghosts and takes back his son's guitar, to which he's ecstatic about. The final quest comes along when the ghosts directly attack the citizens of the city, and Pac-Man vows to hunt down the ghosts at their lair to stop them from harassing the innocents of the city. What I've neglected to tell you until now is that the ghosts aren't acting of their own accord. They're actually being led by a big bad supervillain, the aptly named Ghost Witch, this terrifying nightmare of a sprite that somehow has powers capable of destroying the ghosts without even touching them. She has some kind of beef with Pac-Man that's never really explained. I guess you have to watch the cartoon for that, but I never did. So for all I know, this guy just cut her in line at the deli one day and never looked back. But anyway, she's doing everything she can to inconvenience Pac-Man and his family, and after taking repeated setbacks in this game, attempts to create a monster that will stop the yellow rotunda from messing with her affairs ever again. But this monster, this overwhelming, terrible creation of hers, is made out of chewing gum. And not just any chewing gum, oh no. This monster is made out of ABC gum. And if you're not hip or simply repress your childhood playground experiences like I do, let me explain. ABC gum stands for already been chewed gum, meaning they're running up to the poor innocent kids in this city, knocking them over and ripping their jaws open just to pull out their half-chewed and tasteless bubblegum out of their mouths to manufacture a monster to stop a cartoon being from bugging them while they're being bullies. I have no words. This game is full of a bunch of comedic nonsense, and I guess I can understand why. Pac-Man is a franchise that's always dwelled in the lighthearted and very obviously aimed to make this game for children. So I guess it makes sense if you just don't think about it too hard, like ever. This game has an embarrassing amount of heart put into it. The tone is completely light and fluffy almost the entire time. The only really scary bits are when the game turns a narrative chapter and Pac-Man finishes a quest. Everything gets dark and the Ghost Witch comes out of nowhere to turn up her spooky powers and attack the ghosts. But even when she's on screen threatening Pac-Man and the ghosts are flying around, and when you finally confront the gum monster and the witch herself at the secret laboratory, she's running around like a goof with eyes way too big for her head, and the monster is made of purple goop and making garbled noises at you. This game loves to use really obnoxious sound clips to accentuate the action as well. Really loud pops and bangs when Pac-Man collides with something, and the absolutely hilarious gibberish that comes out of his mouth when you piss him off or make him sad. Pac-Man doesn't actually talk in this game, at least not with a real voice. He has speech bubbles sometimes, during the cutscenes when something important happens. Any other time though, when he talks to the player or another character during gameplay, it's all played out over these retro, super synthetic Animal Crossing dubs. It's very much a precursor to Banjo-Kazooie speak, and it's absolutely hilarious. Slapping him in the face too many times with a slingshot pebble, or doing something in the game that upsets him, gets him to stare at the screen and start chewing you out. There's something surreal about seeing a video game character look directly at you and cuss you out while you can't understand a single word that he says. Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures released to mixed reviews in 1994, with American video game magazine Game Pro, saying that while the game was definitely innovative and intriguing, the inability to directly control Pac-Man himself was annoying and, quote, sometimes makes you wish for the simplicity of the original. Another review of the Genesis version stated that the game had, quote, an acquired taste, but wholeheartedly approved of the innovative challenge, also highlighting the game's animation and, can you even call this voice acting? Later on, in November of that year, Famitsu magazine gave the Super Famicom version of the game a 7 out of 10 as well. Future games of the franchise wouldn't revisit this style of gameplay ever again. Instead, the focus of the series transitioned to that of which many developers were gravitating toward with the technological changes on the horizon: 3D. You could say that the transition to 3D was difficult for Pac-Man, as his concept didn't really leave a lot of room for creativity with its simplistic design philosophy. This forced Namco to find alternate ways to apply the same familiar aspects of Pac-Man, but in a different light, and they eventually landed on a traditional 3D platformer approach. Alongside handheld and PC releases of different forms of their 2D games, consoles like the PlayStation and the Dreamcast received titles like Pac-Man World and Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness, which were developed to be in 3D. This trend continues to be pushed today, with Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures being released in 2013 featuring 3D level design, and Pac-Man re-releases featuring new sprites and maps for digital downloads everywhere. The New Adventures was a game that I played in my early childhood, and I found it ridiculously difficult to play. That was probably because at the time, my child brain couldn't comprehend that I couldn't actually do anything directly to Pac-Man himself, and always blundered into the stupidest of deaths and defeats. I found all of the fun ways to die, whether that was getting torn up by a cat, or tripping over a rock onto a skateboard and eating shit, or simply misjudging a glide under a rock formation. This game is a massive test in patience and forces you to consider not only the logic of real life, but also your knowledge on video game logic and irregularity. All the while, it bombards you with dramatic sound effects, explosive theme songs, and very, very enthusiastic sprite animations. This game is like the perfect 5 out of 10. It's got wonderful ambitions and innovative concepts, yet the execution, it leaves a lot to be desired. I don't see this game talked about nearly enough online, and maybe that's because a lot of people either didn't play it, or perhaps it's just something that's better left forgotten by time. But to me, it's an interesting memory that refuses to go away. Something crazy about that face just rocks me to my absolute core. And now I've shared that memory with you, and I don't have to be the only one that sees that box art face in my waking nightmares anymore. Thanks for coming along this little rabbit hole with me. I greatly appreciated your company. Don't forget to be kind and rewind, and have a wonderful night. Excelsior.